It started small, almost too small to notice, like a pebble dropped in still water, sending ripples no one takes seriously until it's too late. The first thing was a letter, a notice in my mailbox from the HOA, saying my lawn was a quarter-inch too high. I laughed. I genuinely laughed out loud. It was summer. Grass grows. I trimmed it that same afternoon and moved on. But that was just the beginning. That was the first warning sign, and I ignored it. A week later, another notice arrived. This time, it said my trash bins were visible from the street for more than 30 minutes after pickup. Strange, because I worked from home and had brought them in within 15. Still, I didn't argue. I didn't want trouble. I just assumed they were being overly cautious. I gave them the benefit of the doubt. After all, an HOA is supposed to protect the neighborhood, right? Maintain order, raise property values, make things beautiful and safe. That's what they sell you when you buy in. But the notices kept coming. One for a small garden I planted in the front yard, unauthorized landscaping. Another because the shade of paint I used on my shutters was too dark compared to community standards, even though it was approved on their list. Every time I tried to ask questions, I got vague answers. It's in the CC and RS. It's a violation of the architectural guidelines. But when I asked for copies of those documents, I was told to submit a formal request. And then, weeks would go by with no reply. I started noticing something else. Not everyone was being held to the same rules. One neighbor had a whole second mailbox installed, clearly unapproved. No notice. Another had a rotting fence, half fallen over, visible from the street for months. Nothing. But me? I was being cited for decorative wind chimes. A welcome mat. My car parked half an inch over a faded curb line. It was selective, and I began to realize I was being watched. I didn't want to believe it at first. I thought maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe it was coincidence. But then a neighbor, quietly, privately, pulled me aside one evening while I was out watering the lawn. She said, "They're targeting you. You're too independent." She didn't elaborate, just said she'd been there before, and to be careful. That shook me. I didn't know what she meant by too independent until I learned about the inner circle. The board members who treated the HOA like their private kingdom. The treasurer who signed checks with no oversight. The president who had family members doing community work at inflated costs, without bids or approval. I tried to attend a board meeting to ask questions. I was told the agenda was closed. I showed up anyway, and they told me the meeting was canceled due to lack of quorum, even though I saw the board members chatting inside. One of them closed the door in my face. That night, I looked through everything I had, the notices, the dated pictures, the HOA handbook. I saw inconsistencies, contradictions, rules that shifted depending on who was enforcing them. But still, I didn't fight. I thought I could reason with them. I wrote emails. I requested clarification. I stayed respectful. Then came the fine, a $1,200 penalty for failure to comply with repeated violations. I was stunned. I had proof of compliance, receipts, photos, and even timestamp video. I sent them everything, and they said it wasn't sufficient, that I needed to take it up with the board. I asked for a hearing. I was denied. Then, I got a letter from an attorney. The HOA had placed a lien on my property. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about rules. It wasn't about aesthetics or order. It was about control. I had ignored the warning signs because I didn't want conflict. I believed in playing fair. I thought if I followed the rules, I'd be left alone. But they didn't want compliance. They wanted obedience, silence, submission. Anything less was a threat. Every time I tried to speak up, they doubled down. Every question I asked was met with resistance. Every attempt to de-escalate was met with escalation. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with a group of concerned neighbors. I was dealing with a machine, one that thrived on secrecy, that punished dissent, and that operated like a government without accountability. And I had let it grow right under my nose. There's a kind of silence that doesn't bring peace. It hangs in the air like fog, heavy and choking, filling the spaces between neighbors, between friends, between people who used to wave at each other from their porches. It's the kind of silence that grows when fear moves in, quiet, creeping, and calculated. In our neighborhood, that silence came courtesy of the HOA. At first, I thought I was the only one feeling it. The only one questioning the notices, the arbitrary rules, the way some people seem to get away with everything while others were harassed over nonsense. But it didn't take long before I saw the pattern. People didn't talk about the HOA. Not openly. Not at meetings. Not in Facebook groups. Even behind closed doors, conversations were short, guarded, full of phrases like, "be careful," and "you didn't hear it from me." I noticed that some of my neighbors had started avoiding me, not out of dislike, but out of fear. The ones who had once chatted with me during morning walks now crossed the street or quickly shut their garage doors when I passed. One woman, who I used to share gardening tips with, messaged me one evening. She said she supported me, but couldn't be seen talking to me anymore. "They watch," she wrote. "They take notes, and they retaliate." That word, retaliate, kept surfacing, quietly, in whispers, in a way people looked over their shoulders before speaking. The HOA wasn't just a group of volunteers doing their civic duty. It had become a small-town power structure, built on fear, maintained by silence. They controlled the fines, the approvals, the access to meetings, the contractors, even the community social events. And anyone who challenged that control became a target. One homeowner told me about how she got a letter threatening legal action because her holiday lights were up 2 days past the suggested removal date. Another man shared how his request for a new roof was denied 3 times, only to find out later that a board member's cousin owned the only roofing company that was consistently approved. They both asked me not to mention their names. "I still have to live here," they said. That sentence echoed in my head. I still have to live here. It was psychological warfare disguised as community management. Every vague citation, every denied request, every sudden rule change, it all sent the same message. Don't push back. Don't speak up. Don't step out of line. And if you do, we'll make you regret it. The HOA had turned the idea of community standards into a weapon, one that kept people compliant through anxiety, confusion, and a looming threat of financial punishment. I started to understand how deep the control ran when I requested financial records from the HOA, which I had every right to do as a homeowner. My request was ignored. I sent it again, certified mail. This time, I got a response. I could view the documents, but only during a 30-minute window on a weekday morning inside their lawyer's office, with no copies or photos allowed. It was a barrier, a test, and most people would have walked away at that point, chalking it up to bureaucracy. That's how they kept everyone quiet. Make it difficult. Make it intimidating. Make it seem not worth the fight. And then there were the meetings, supposedly open to all residents, but in practice, tightly controlled. The board would announce meetings with barely any notice, hold them during work hours, or quietly change locations. When people did manage to show up, the board would shut down questions, cut off speakers mid-sentence, or declare the topic not on the agenda. I watched one woman try to bring up a dangerous sinkhole near her property. They told her she was out of order. The meeting moved on. She walked out in tears. This wasn't just about bad management. It was about power. The HOA used the structure of authority to control the narrative, isolate dissenters, and discourage transparency. And it worked. The silence in our neighborhood wasn't natural. It was manufactured, designed, enforced. And the longer it lasted, the stronger the board became. People knew what was happening, but they were afraid. They had mortgages, families, jobs. They didn't want the stress. They didn't want to lose sleep wondering if they'd be the next one fined or sued. So they stayed quiet. They played along. They followed the rules, even when the rules didn't make sense, because it was safer that way. Because silence was the price of peace. Or at least the illusion of it. The letter arrived on a Thursday. A thick white envelope, the kind that carries weight before you even open it. I knew something was wrong just by the way it looked, formal, official, cold. When I tore it open, my heart sank. It was a notice from the HOA's attorney. They were taking me to court. The words blurred for a second. I had to sit down and read it again, line by line, each sentence like a punch to the chest. They accused me of repeated violations, of noncompliance, of creating a nuisance to the community. And they were seeking damages. Real, financial damages. At first, I didn't believe it. I thought it had to be a mistake, a scare tactic, but it wasn't. This was real. I was being sued by the people who were supposed to be protecting the neighborhood. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was a defendant, a target. And it didn't take long before I realized just how much power they could wield once they made the system work for them. They weren't interested in resolution. They didn't want compromise. They wanted to bury me in paperwork, legal jargon, and mounting pressure. I got email after email from their attorney's office, demands, deadlines, declarations. It was overwhelming. I spent hours on hold with my own lawyer, trying to make sense of it all. Try to explain how this had started with a few citations that made no sense and snowballed into a lawsuit I never saw coming. The legal documents were dense, filled with accusations twisted out of context. They cited minor infractions like they were criminal offenses. They used vague language, deliberately confusing, calling my behavior aggressive, my questions obstructive, my requests for documentation hostile. It wasn't about what I did. It was about how they could frame it. And once it was in the court system, I was on the defensive. I had to prove I wasn't the problem, all while trying to navigate a process designed to be punishing. I learned quickly that HOAs know how to play the long game. They count on the average homeowner not having the resources to fight back. They know the cost of hiring a lawyer, filing motions, and preparing for court is enough to make most people fold. That's what they were betting on, that I'd give up, settle, pay the fines, sign the agreements, and stay quiet. That I'd take the hit and walk away. But I couldn't, because I knew what this really was. It wasn't about violations or rules. It was about retaliation. They wanted to make an example out of me, to show everyone else in the neighborhood what happens when you challenge their authority, when you don't stay in line, when you refuse to be intimidated. The courtroom wasn't just about the outcome. It was about the performance. They came in with thick binders, matching suits, and smug expressions. They thought they had already won. To them, this wasn't a legal dispute. It was a message. I sat there, looking at the faces of the people who had once smiled at block parties and waved during morning walks. Now they sat across from me, stone-faced, arguing that I was the threat, that I was the danger to our community. They used everything against me: emails, photos, even snippets of conversations taken out of context. They painted a version of me that wasn't real, but it didn't matter. It didn't have to be real. It just had to sound convincing enough. What shook me the most wasn't just the tactics they used. It was how easy it was for them to do it. They had legal funds pulled from homeowner dues. They had authority backed by contracts I'd signed years ago without realizing what I was agreeing to. They had the luxury of time and resources. And they had no reason to stop because the system allowed it. Because the people in charge wrote the rules and enforced them however they pleased. In that courtroom, I saw how the balance of power was completely broken. I saw how an HOA could act like judge, jury, and executioner, with no oversight, no accountability, and no regard for fairness. I wasn't just up against a lawsuit. I was up against a system that protected itself at all costs. A system that expected people to surrender out of fear or exhaustion. And I saw how easily justice could be twisted into a tool for control. After that day in court, something inside me shifted. I went home, closed the door behind me, and sat in silence for a long time. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but calculating. I wasn't going to let them win. Not because I craved revenge or because I wanted to make a spectacle, but because I needed the truth. I needed to understand how far the rot went, how deep the corruption ran. That night, I opened my laptop and started digging. The first thing I looked into was the HOA budget. They had refused to send me a copy when I asked as a homeowner, but I found an old digital PDF from a previous year buried in an archived community newsletter. It was vague, almost deliberately unclear. Big expense categories like administrative costs, operational fees, discretionary projects. No specifics, no receipts, no breakdowns, just big numbers and bigger questions. I cross-referenced that with contractor names I remembered seeing around the neighborhood. Landscaping trucks, maintenance workers, painters. A few of them didn't even have proper business licenses. One company, which had supposedly been paid over $40,000 for tree trimming the previous year, was registered to a P.O. box with no reviews, no website, and no public records of service. The more I uncovered, the more disturbing it became. A board member's husband ran a cleaning company that was being paid monthly for clubhouse sanitation, but the clubhouse hadn't been open in months. The HOA was charging homeowners for amenities that were closed, services that were irregular, and improvements that never actually materialized. There were line items for security patrols on days no security personnel were present. In some cases, invoices were duplicated with minor date changes. It was sloppy, but they had gotten away with it because no one had ever checked. I filed a formal request under the state's HOA transparency law, demanding access to 5 years of financial records. I knew they would delay it, maybe even deny it again, but I wanted the paper trail. While I waited, I started reaching out to past board members, people who had left quietly, who might know more than they ever let on. Some ignored me. A few responded with vague encouragement, but no details. But one, an older man who had resigned after a single year, finally agreed to meet in private. We met at a coffee shop across town. He looked over his shoulder before sitting down. He didn't want to be seen with me. He told me what I had started to suspect. Most board decisions were made in private, outside of meetings, sometimes over drinks or in someone's backyard. Financial votes were often passed without quorum. Contracts were handed out without bidding, and any homeowner who questioned it got hit with violations, fines, or legal threats. He showed me emails he had saved from his time on the board, discussions about neutralizing certain residents, including one labeled as a troublemaker who had since moved away under pressure. It was a coordinated operation, not some disorganized mess. They knew what they were doing. They were covering for each other, signing off on each other's deals, and keeping everything behind a wall of bureaucracy and fear. I started to wonder how many families had paid inflated dues without realizing they were funding a scam. How many had moved out after feeling helpless? How many had given up because fighting back seemed impossible? With each new file, each conversation, I built a clearer picture of what had been happening behind the scenes. And it wasn't just financial. It was personal. Some homeowners have been denied architectural approvals because of personal grudges. Others had their complaints conveniently lost or never addressed. The rules weren't being enforced. They were being weaponized, bent, twisted, and used as tools to silence opposition, reward loyalty, and keep the board in power. When I finally got a partial batch of the financial records, what I saw confirmed everything. Payments without matching receipts. Gaps in the accounting. Dates that didn't line up. Reimbursements issued to board members for miscellaneous expenses with no explanation. And most telling of all, a trail of overlapping signatures. Same names, over and over again, signing off on each other's reimbursements, approvals, and projects. It was a cycle of corruption disguised as community governance. I wasn't surprised anymore, but I was determined. The truth was out there, hidden in the fine print, buried under years of silence and manipulation. All it took was someone willing to ask the questions they hoped no one would ever ask. I knew I couldn't win this by playing their game. They had home court advantage, deep pockets funded by homeowner dues, and a network of legal protections built over years of unchecked power. But what they didn't have was the truth on their side, and they definitely didn't expect me to gather enough evidence to force their hand. That's when everything changed. That's when I decided to turn the tables. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every email, every voicemail. I recorded conversations, took photos, saved PDFs, and kept backups of everything in multiple locations. I kept a timeline, built a file, cross-referenced every claim they made with documents I could find in public records. When they claimed I hadn't responded to a notice, I showed email confirmations with timestamps. When they said I failed to correct a violation, I provided photos with that day's newspaper in frame. I wasn't just defending myself, I was building a case. But I wasn't going to do it alone. I started quietly reaching out to other homeowners who had hinted at past issues with the board. I didn't ask them to take sides. I just asked them to talk. Slowly, carefully, the stories began to emerge. A woman who had been fined for repainting her garage door, even though she had board approval in writing. A couple forced to remove solar panels that had been approved for others. A family threatened with daily fines over a non-existent, unauthorized structure that turned out to be a children's sandbox. They were cautious at first, scared. Most had already tried to push back and gotten burned. But when I showed them what I'd found, the misused funds, the internal emails, the overlapping conflicts of interest, they stopped whispering. They started getting angry. And that was the shift. That's when it stopped being just my fight. I brought in a licensed forensic accountant. She reviewed the HOA's budgets, expenditures, and financial statements. What she found was damning. Overlapping payments to vendors with connections to board members. Funds misallocated to line items that didn't match the service invoices. Year-end carryover amounts that mysteriously disappeared. She put together a report, detailed, professional, undeniable, and she agreed to testify if needed. Then I requested a formal audit under the HOA's own bylaws, which legally required one upon homeowner petition. The board tried to deny it, claiming it was unnecessary. But by then, I had over 60 signatures from residents. They were forced to comply. When the audit began, the board scrambled. Emails went unanswered. The HOA's attorney got involved again, trying to stall the process. But the pressure was mounting. The truth was already leaking. I decided to take it public. I compiled a summary of the findings, facts only, with citations, and mailed a copy to every home in the neighborhood. No accusations, just information. I also created a private website that laid out the timeline, the financial inconsistencies, the documents I had uncovered. I didn't use my name. I didn't have to. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. Then came the open board meeting. Normally, only a few people showed up. That night, the room was packed. Standing room only. People who had never spoken up before were there, arms crossed, questions ready. The board tried to open with a scripted statement, but they were drowned out by demands for answers. Residents brought up the audit, the misuse of funds, the selective enforcement, the retaliation. They wanted transparency. They wanted resignations. One by one, the board members crumbled under pressure. Some tried to deflect, others tried to justify. But the documents I'd exposed left little room for defense. One member walked out mid-meeting. Another offered to step down on the spot. It wasn't a courtroom, but it felt like a trial. And for once, they were the ones answering questions. The legal case they had brought against me began to fall apart. Their attorney started to withdraw claims. Witnesses changed their stories. The narrative they had built for months began to unravel. And with it, their control. Neighbors who had once been silent came forward with their own documents, their own stories. People began asking to recall the board entirely. New candidates volunteered to run. A movement had started, not led by me, but sparked by the truth. The HOA had wanted to make an example out of me. They had hoped that dragging me to court would break me, scare others into silence. But instead, their own tactics became the evidence that exposed them. The fight they picked became the spark that lit the fire. And everything they had tried to keep hidden was now out in the open for all to see. The courtroom battle was over, but the fight didn't end there. When you go up against an organization built on power, control, and secrecy, the aftermath is never simple. Winning wasn't about celebration. It wasn't about a clean victory. It was about survival, about walking through the wreckage of what they tried to do to me and figuring out what came next. I thought that once the truth came out, things would fall back into place, that people would see the corruption for what it was and justice would run its course. But the reality was more complicated. Some of the board members resigned under pressure. Others stayed, hoping to weather the storm. They tried to spin their side of the story, claiming misunderstandings, clerical errors, miscommunication. They tried to paint the audit as flawed, the signatures as coerced, the complaints as exaggerated. But the neighborhood had already seen too much. People weren't buying it anymore. The whispers had turned into voices, and the voices into a collective demand for change. Meetings were now full. Neighbors who once stayed silent were showing up, speaking out, asking questions. But even as the tide turned, I felt the weight of everything I had gone through. The legal bills, the sleepless nights, the stress that had taken a toll on my health, my family, my peace of mind. The sense that I could never fully relax in my own home again. There were still eyes watching. Still those who saw me as the enemy, simply because I had pulled back the curtain on their comfortable illusion. Some neighbors thanked me, quietly, respectfully. Others avoided me altogether, afraid that being seen in support of me might make them the next target if the old guard regained any footing. The documents I uncovered didn't just expose financial mismanagement. They revealed how deep the personal agendas had gone. Petty grudges turned into citations. Disagreements escalated into legal threats. Resources that should have improved the community had been funneled into pet projects, favors, and cover-ups. The very people entrusted to protect our shared spaces had used that power for themselves. And in the process, they divided the community, broke trust, and created an atmosphere of suspicion that would take years to undo. New elections were held. A group of homeowners, independent, unaffiliated, tired of the lies, stepped forward to run. They promised transparency, accountability, and fairness. I didn't run. I didn't want power. I just wanted to make sure no one else would be forced to go through what I had endured. But I did support them. I helped them understand the documents, the budgets, the traps hidden in the bylaws. I stayed involved, not as a leader, but as a witness. One of the hardest parts of the aftermath was accepting what had been lost. Time, money, trust. Things that can't always be recovered with a court ruling or a new board. Friendships had been strained. Families had moved out. The neighborhood felt different now. More aware, yes, but also more cautious. The illusion that we were all just friendly neighbors living in harmony was gone. In its place was something more fragile. Truth. And with truth comes reckoning. I received letters from people in other communities, neighbors in other HOAs who had seen my story online or heard through mutual contacts. They were facing similar battles, similar abuses. They asked how I had done it, how I had found the strength, what tools I had used, what rights they had. I answered every single one, because I knew this wasn't just about me or even just about my neighborhood. This was about a larger problem, unchecked authority behind the walls of planned communities, where power goes unchallenged until someone dares to push back. The scars of the fight remained. I still second-guessed every notice in my mailbox. I still kept my documents backed up in triplicate. I still walked the neighborhood with a wary eye. But there was also something new, something harder to name. Not pride exactly, and not relief either. Maybe it was resolve. Maybe it was knowing that I hadn't backed down, even when the odds were stacked against me. Maybe it was knowing that the lies didn't get to win. Even after everything, I knew the work wasn't done. Exposing corruption is only the first step. The harder task is rebuilding the trust that corruption destroys. Teaching people to believe again, in fairness, in process, in each other. It would take time, but at least now, the truth had a place in the open. And at least now, we all knew what was possible when someone refuses to stay silent.